I'm going to be talking for 15 minutes or so about what I think is relevant, which is how do you get investment, how do you get customers, how do you build a startup, which I think a lot of people in this room are interested in. The one big asterisk I'll put in it is this is one story. So in different spaces, in different communities, it may be very different, but it makes it easier for me to just tell our one story. So I'll do that, and then I'll try and say what I've learned as time has gone by, and you know, if you could start all over again, maybe what you'd do different, and then Daniel will follow on and tell you just really how to get money. For those who don't know what Figshare does, it doesn't really matter too much to this talk, but we try to make all academic research outputs openly available. So this really, a lot of people in this room will have been involved in academia. You publish a lot of papers, but now people are doing cool stuff like, if you have an allosaur tooth, which I guess is a dinosaur, how do you publish that? How do you publish a tooth? Well, you can 3D scan it and make it available. And so we do lots of cool visualizations, but slide. We mainly, this is the most important thing, is we work with researchers, publishers, and institutions, so universities. And if you'd have asked us at the beginning what we do, we'd say we work with researchers. So this is the first point about, there's this idea of fail fast, fail often. You can discuss the pros and cons of that, but if this is more a case of, if there's more money on the table, maybe go after that, because that will help your company be around in a year. And that's kind of what happened with publishers and institutions. And now we're trying to work with academic funders as well. Oh, thanks. This is where our clients are. We've been going a few years now, started in about 2011, 2012. And so you can see we're becoming pretty global, which is hard to support. And one thing I'll talk about a little bit later. Slide. But this, if you go to our website, this is where we're based. We have two main offices. One is in London, one is in Yash. We've had 4 different offices in Yash, and now we're settled for a while because it's a very competitive space. But this is one of the things. If you want to, the good thing about being a web-based startup, which I think a lot of people are thinking about, because it scales really well to the point where we can have clients in South Africa and we can have clients in Australia. But if everybody is here or here, then who's taking the calls with Australia? And so that is one thing you need to be aware of. It's very hard to scale or ask lots of things of people as you scale if you do truly want to be international. So how international you want to be really is a question of how late at night do you want to work. Because if nobody else is going to do it, it's going to be you taking the call. Slide. So there's 2 main bits to this 10-minute talk. My amazing graphic that I did here. There's the 2 things I want to talk about is what I think is you basically run 3 different types of company, depending on where you are as a company. And it's to do with investment, and it's also to do with revenue. And so this is log scale, but you could change that to 5-digit investment, 6-digit investment, 7-digit investment. So just a show of hands, who here is interested in the idea of maybe starting their own company or start building an app or making some money at some point doing stuff like that? So there's loads. Okay, and so this thing, the other caveat I want to add as well is I came out straight out of academia into this, so I didn't know any of these things. And you learn as you go. So you don't need to know everything. It's a steep learning curve. But there's definitely a difference between being here, and being here. The reality of somebody investing €1 million in your startup on day 1 is very slim. Not even Daniel will do it. Yeah, maybe. But you really have to think about what do you need for this, what do you need for this, and what do you need for this. And this could be 50 grand, 500,000, 5 million. They're all just logs of how much investment you're getting. And so the first thing, sorry, slide, I wanted to talk about is you need a proof of concept. And I chose this amazing thing because, as I said, I'm a hacky coder at best. I'm not a designer, but I thought that these colors were the best color scheme available on the internet. I bleed fluorescent colors. So it's also good to learn early on what your limitations are. And I've always been okay with that. If somebody tells me that they're a marketer or they're a designer, I put 100% of my faith in them. I say, well, if you've told me this is what you do, then do it. But if you can't do it, or if you put out crap like this, you'll prove to me pretty quickly that you aren't a designer or you aren't. So, but the thing about this is, this got us to that first level of funding. So this is the difference between I have an idea and this is something that's feasible and you can build something. But no matter what it is, build a proof of concept. If you turn up to pitch somebody and you have a functioning version of a site, they'll take you a lot more seriously. This was WordPress and MediaWiki. It doesn't have to be complicated. There's people in my own team laughing at me for this. Slide. The other thing here is I use this photo on the right-hand side. My girlfriend sent me this picture saying, I can't believe they stole my idea. This is an app that you take a picture of your food, and it tells you how many calories are in that food, and tracks it for you. I mean, they didn't steal your app. That's probably taken 15 years of artificial intelligence, image processing to get to that level. That's probably taken millions and millions and millions of investment to get to that level. Nobody stole her idea. Other people had the idea and executed on it. And this is more of a point on, if you just turn up with an idea and say, I've got this really great idea, the investor could just say, cool, well, I've got a team over here who, a team of developers, we'll just build that idea. But if you have a proof of concept, it shows you know the space a bit better and they'll try and take you more seriously. So build a proof of concept, idea number one. Take home number one, slide, sorry. And then so from that first tier investment, we managed to, I say we, it was me and 3 guys who are probably in this room now, then spent Christmas 2011 rebuilding that beautiful version of my site. So what would happen if you got professionals to build that site? And so as a result of that, we built it, and it was obviously a good idea because TechCrunch picked it up the moment it went live, which is also good because it gets you loads of attention and loads of early users. Publicity at this level is something that you take for granted very early on. It is nigh on impossible to get on things like TechCrunch. So if you have those opportunities, you take those calls. But this is what can catapult you to getting the next level of funding, because if you get mainstream attention, it's a good way. The other thing to help you get to that next level of funding is, okay, you've got a good idea. How's it going to pay for itself? People think it's a good idea. TechCrunch are writing about it, it must be a good idea. You get about 20 calls from investors, by the way, if you're on TechCrunch. So it's a good idea, it's got legs. And then the next slide is, how do you get to that next level? So at the time, Daniel, who's going to be talking after me for Digital Science said, we like the idea, we'll give you some money. Similar to what the incubator that we're here at today is doing, we'll give you some money to help grow you to that next level. But then what is it that takes you to the next level? So we got our first publisher customer. So if you've got a proof of concept and then you can justify a business model, you can justify that people are willing to pay for this, then that's a good way to go. Interestingly, this is now our worst customer because of the things that you agree to at the beginning. I had a meeting with these guys. They came in and they asked us to do a bit of custom development, and I was so happy that people were thinking about paying us. They said, how much would it cost to develop that feature? And I said, I don't know, a couple of grand. Later that afternoon, I got a contract sent over saying, we agree to pay you £2,000 for the services. And I was like, oh, okay, that's how it works. Probably went in a bit low there. Slide. And so that really helps you get to the point, which is you have a good idea, you have a proof of concept, and that can take you to the next levels of funding, which is what we were lucky to do enough to do with digital science, because we could prove that we had a good idea and we could prove that we had funding. We had a business model. Slide. This is also, in between those two phases, is a good time to think about your own role in the position, particularly if you start it. I wasn't CEO up until the point where we got funding. I actually wasn't CEO. The reason we introduced C-level is because we had a CTO, so I thought we better have a CEO as well, and then I had to make the decision, do I want that to be me? Because it's very easy, your ego comes in at this stage and you're like, yeah, I'd love to be a CEO. People treat you nice if you've got CEO on your name. But what are the team strengths? What are your team weaknesses? In reality, you can be a different type of CEO as well. Like, I'm okay on the marketing sales side of things. I'm less good on the financial operations side of things. But you can still play that role. You just need to plug that gap with other team members as you go. So you need to think about that. And then revenue. Again, there's 3 different stages, and again at the same kind of level. How do you grow revenue? Because the company that's making 5-figure deals, that is what I was talking about before. We will do anything for you to start working with you. And then you get to the point where you're like, oh, we've got a few people who are doing the same, who we can sell the same product to, and now it's starting to scale. But to get to the big jump to 7 figures, you really need to have something that you can just cookie cutter and scale and release. This is something that's good about web development and software as a service, because it helps you grow. Slide. The other thing to consider is it's always good to extend your roadmap. You need to constantly be thinking about the time it takes you to get a customer, the time it takes you to get investment. If you start talking with someone about investment at, 500,000 euros, it'll take you a year before contracts are signed, no matter what. No one's going to give you that tomorrow. They might say, in theory, we'll do that with you, let's start the paperwork, but it'll take you, you always have to, so you have to think, how am I going to last for a year? And the other thing is, what about stuff at that point? The point between when you're first getting clients and when you're starting to make money, that is the time when you should be building all the cool stuff that you think you're going to need that doesn't bring you money. So we have an API, it's super important, it doesn't make us any money, but it's super useful for us being innovative in the space. And so slide, that was in 2012, but now we're at this point. These are some of the universities we're working with. And if we didn't build an API back in 2012, we wouldn't have time to do it now, because the thing about customers is they're very demanding. So we built something that scales, that works with all of these universities across the whole world, but at the same time, they have very different ideas on what they need and how we can do it. So you need to be able to get the cool stuff done before customers start taking up most of your time. Slide. And then I've got a couple more slides left. I won't take you too long. This bit here is, I had revenue, but not everybody's goal is revenue. And that's cool as long as you're very transparent with your team and with your investors. Your investors might be the other way as well. They might only care about revenue. So if they only care about revenue, you have to be concerned with revenue. But it might be, we want to grow 10 million users. That might be the way they want to grow, or the way you want to grow. It's not our model, but your goal also might be, we'd like to do societal change. We'd like to do something that benefits society. but you still have to be sustainable. We're a team of 35, 40 people now. We do think that we're helping the space and making some societal change. Still a long way to go, but everybody still needs to pay their mortgages at the end of the month as well. So there's a balancing act between what you're trying to do and what your goals are, but you should try and be transparent about them. Slide, sorry. Yeah, so this is just to emphasize this point of scaling is hard, and there's a lot of things that you can't do everything. You can try and do everything, and it is a balancing act on the technical side as well as everything else. So one of the most interesting things I find about scaling is not just building loads of different, working with loads of different clients and them having different agendas. It's 35 to 40 people is a good number for people to have different motivations themselves. So trying to understand why people are working in the space with you. It might be that they're 100% driven to have that societal change. It might be they're 100% financially driven. It might be that they like building products as opposed to working in an insurance company where you're told what to do. No offense to those who do that. So that's one thing that I think takes up way more time than you anticipate. The second thing is clients, and these 2 and 3, as I've already iterated, is all that crap that you promise your early customers. You do have to support that. I would recommend still doing it though, because you need to get those customers early on. You've just got to accept it. It makes it difficult, but you've got to accept it. Slide, sorry. It isn't necessarily best to be the first to market. This is something I thought we were first to market in our space, and I thought, this is giving us such an advantage over everybody else. You know, no one's going to ever catch us. And then we found out that one of our competitors just had our screen open on one screen, our product open on one screen, and then building it on the other screen. So if you get to the point where you are first to market and you've done something that works, people can copy that pretty quickly. So it's really hard to then, the amount of time we went into planning new features, they can just copy. So it's very hard to stay ahead of people if you are first to market. Slide. And this is kind of relevancy and staying cool. We see this now, we're like 5 or 6 years old, and we see this now that you get loads of people who we think they're not doing, they'll take a slightly different angle, and they get all the new publicity. And all of our salespeople are like, oh, how come we're not getting all this publicity? And it's because they're new, and we're old news. So in terms of trying to stay relevant, it takes a lot of work, and you need to play the angles. And that's why I think having a marketing focus is really important. And this is from 2014. So this is 3 years after we started. The pitch deck is probably the same as when we started, but with a startup of the week. Why we weren't the startup of the week in 2011? It's just you infiltrate different media at different times, but it needs to be something that's constantly done in order to stay relevant in the market and in order to get that next level of funding as well. You'll see a lot of people getting in big publications, and you think, wow, how have they got in here? They've suddenly in every publication I read, and then 2 weeks later you'll hear about them raising money, and they will be paying for magazines to do pieces on them. It is a thing that happens. We haven't done it. We haven't got that much money. Next slide. It takes a long time to become an overnight success, and this blows my mind. Is I was just chatting with Daniel and Lauren in the car about 8 years is break-even point on average for a software as a service company, which is the space we're in. But overnight successes. So I think about us, because I've done it every day for 5 or 6 years, that I think, man, we've been around forever, and we've been working hard forever. Whereas Snapchat only came out like last summer, right? But Snapchat came out before us. They just didn't get there until 2017. Airbnb and Uber, those companies are 10 years old. But I didn't use an Airbnb for the last 3 years, so that's something that if I could think back and think what I did, or the vision that I had in my head, I thought we were going to get 1 million users sign up straight away. You see that in a lot of pitch decks. We'll just scale to 2 million users, and then 1% of them will be paying. It's like, oh, cool. How are you going to get 2 million users? Because we haven't got 2 million users, and we've been going a long time. Slide. And so this is my last bit, and I'm happy to answer any questions now. I'll go on to Daniel. But that was kind of just the story of one company and how it grew, and the idea that there's things that I would advise you to think about as a company grows, and there's things I would advise you to think about as what I would definitely do again and what I've learned. And the 3 things that I'd say are constant kind of human battles is you can't please all of the people all the time. You know, you think you're going to build the happiest place to work because you have that opportunity, and I think you should always be aiming for that. But different people have different agendas, and they'll clash. You can't do that. You can try. Be accountable, but not to the level where it makes you ill. Yeah, I remember the beginning and thinking, I wasn't bothered about myself because I was straight out of being a student. So I had, you know, like, I didn't have a mortgage to pay. But as soon as you start employing people and they've got kids, and you're like, oh God, if we don't get this deal, then these guys are going to lose their house. If you let that get to you, it'll make you very stressed very quick. So you have to be accountable, but just assume that everybody is trying their best to do that, and then you are being accountable. And the last one is communicate. This is something that year on year we try and do more and more, internally, externally, trying to get everybody knowing, particularly because we're in a niche area, why are we doing this, what's the reason behind it, and today we don't do enough. So it's something that you have to work at. Work at innovating, work at communicating, and if you're just getting started, proof of concept, try and get somebody to give you some money for the product, and then investors will give you money to grow the product. It's really interesting in terms of the different growth stages as well, because break even is a really interesting point as well. Because break even is great. I always find that if you look back, Christmas is a good time to look back and think, geez, that's been a good year or whatever, you know, because you stop, everyone stops. But when you get to break even, it's an interesting one because you want to scale. Then you can see, well, if somebody just gave us, you know, a nice boost, we could do these 10 other things now, because we know we've got a working product, and we know we can just continue to sell this. So is our move now just continue to sell our one working product to the 15,000 schools that are out there? Or is it, let's try and spend a chunk of money being innovative and stay at top of the rest of people? So you always feel like you could do with more money, because break even is a nice point to hit. And then you're thinking, well, if someone just gave us 5 million, though, we could kill it.
I think the important thing to realize about digital science is that we're not really a classic investor. We're not a standard investor. We have a very different approach to most people in the space. We are definitely not a VC in the standard sense. If you're up on the kind of tech jargon, we are what some people describe as smart money. That doesn't mean that we all have PhDs, but it does mean that what we try to do is invest in a particular niche, and we try to add value by having deep domain knowledge. So if you talk to a standard venture capitalist, a standard investor, what they're going to try and do is they're going to try and invest in 30 to 50 companies in a portfolio, and they're going to hope that only something like 35 of them fail, and of the 15 that remain, 5 to 7 will do kind of okay, you know, they won't go under, and another 5 to 7 will kind of do pretty well, and 1 will be an absolute out-and-out success, and it'll pay for all the failures. And that's not where digital science is coming from. Digital science, we've done, to date, in the last 8 years, we've done 14 investments. 12 of which are still with us and are still doing well, and 2 of which we've either sold off to other players or we've donated to the space as open source and open access type approaches, which is something, because of the space we're in, that we can do. If you want to work out how to redo an experiment, if you want to access someone's scientific research, their data, if you want to find the surveys associated with a social science study, all of these things are difficult to get your hands on. Naturally, Figshare is one of the technologies that enables you to try and fix some of this infrastructure. If you want a really cool infrastructure for research, then it needs to be much more elegant. The keynote of good infrastructure is that it should disappear into the background. And if you think about the successful pieces of software that you use, they disappear into your background. They become part of your life, and they become frictionless in how you want to achieve a certain aim. And that's what we want to do for research. Let's see if the clicker will work. Thank you, Mark. So this is a better paradigm for the infrastructure. This is what we want to do. This is subtle, this is elegant, this routes all of the right nutrients to all of the parts of the leaf, and you're not really aware of the veins of the leaf. It actually looks rather beautiful. And there are bits of research and bits of science where that actually does, it's already the case. If you think about the structure of a scientific paper or a research paper, if I had a picture of a paper up on the screen and I blacked out the title and the abstract and the names of the co-authors, and I blocked out the writing, and I just showed you the outline of that, you would still recognise where all those elements were on the page. For anybody who's involved in in research, that's really clear. And so our vision, the digital science vision, is to create this elegant and simple infrastructure. And we have a very specific approach of how to do that. Slide. And of course, it is working with young researchers, working with people who are close to the problems. So, as Mark is one of these. Mark is, you see, fluffy, nice. So, it's really important that when you're trying to solve a problem, when you're of the magnitude that we're trying to solve, you engage with people who really understand the problem deeply. And so we look specifically for innovators who are close to a problem and who've solved a problem. And it's interesting that what we do is we invest in people. Mark said ideas are kind of cheap, execution is expensive. He's absolutely right, ideas are cheap. Execution is made even more expensive in our situation by virtue of who we want to invest in. We want to invest in someone with deep domain expertise, but that typically means they're not a standard founder. I mean, Mark is quite exceptional, in fact, in our group, in that he came with skills around social media. He knew how to communicate with people. And the things that Figshare does are really centred in that kind of paradigm, in communicating with people and making sure people are connected with different ideas, different concepts and different content. But you have to make sure that you are investing not just in that idea, but in the group of people around the idea. It's very hard for me as an investor to invest in a single founder. That can only happen a certain amount of time. I can invest in a single founder in the situation that I think my team can complement that founder and help him or her hire around them, and help him or her in the early stages when we don't want to put the money in to hire around them. So I have to be quite careful in who I pick initially. It's also, the reason for the cat is actually it's quite like herding cats. You may have heard the phrase. Working with young entrepreneurs, when we're typically looking at a company that has no revenue, has an idea or a proof of concept, and you're trying to take this thing to be a real company, that's the riskiest stage of the company. And it takes a lot of effort to get from there to where you want the company to be. Slide. So in doing that, you have to think a lot about the mechanisms behind how the company should work. You have to get a team that will work together, that's complementary. They need to have the marketing skill. They need to understand a business model. They need to be able to connect with the market and actually sell the idea as well as the product. They need to come up with a viable business model. And business models are not trivial things to put together. Mark talked a little bit about failing fast, and actually in digital science we try not to fail fast, but we do try to pivot fast. Some of our most successful businesses have been businesses where people see an idea, they're able to develop a piece of software, find a niche for the software, test that out, and actually realise that they're onto something and part of the idea works, and preserve that part of the idea and pivot another piece of the idea into somewhere which actually starts connecting with another group of people, and then preserving that idea when it gets them so far again, pivoting again. So every one of our companies has really gone through this evolution. Digital Science is actually, I should say, it's a company that where the lunatics are in charge of the asylum. I went through this process myself with my first company, which was actually invested in by Digital Science way back when Digital Science launched. And we went through the same process of finding, initially we set ourselves up as a consultancy company. We did consultancy, we learned our trade for about 5 years. We programmed 14 products in 5 years, and one of those products turned out to really hit a niche. And we took that product and we developed it further, and we sold it to a number of institutions. We then pivoted that product a number of times before it got to what it is now. And in each iteration, it's focused on a different slice of the market, much more narrow than Figshare because it's just in the institutional market. What Figshare's done is actually slightly grander scale in that it's pivoted between customer types. But there are these evolutions that you go through as a business. Slide. Thanks. So I think one of our visions, another one of our visions for digital science is that software should be elegant. I talked about that a little bit earlier. One of the things that has not really really caught the imagination in research is really elegant software that does a good job. All of you will have had experience of these massive products like Uber, like Airbnb, that do a job quite slickly. But I would say to you, the interesting thing in our space, in research space, is that user experience isn't enough. And in fact, it's absolutely critical if you want to make that jump into the wide general world where you want to do an Airbnb. But it is very difficult to make user experience into a defensible proposition. Mark talked a little bit about this. If you don't have user experience, you're probably not going to break the market. You're not going to get into where you want to get into. On the other hand, user experience alone is not the thing, not the only thing that can get you to the next stage and make you defensible. What you're really looking for defensibility are key technology advantages that other people can't get. They are things around network effects and people needing to be part of your network in order to achieve some activity. Another very popular and very topical approach is actually data. If you look at machine learning and artificial intelligence technologies, being the key recipient of data from the market is a massive market advantage. I was reflecting the other day, it's actually quite interesting how Apple are currently squandering their advantage. If you think about how long Siri has been out and how much access it has had to data, how much those machine learning algorithms could have been improving my Siri experience, but how actually Siri is really plateaued, and there are other AI technologies which are much more intuitive now than Siri, I think actually puts Apple in a very tricky position. It needs to make a jump. Apple has always relied on a hardware advantage. The beauty of the design is great, and that's why we all want their products, and this is why there's an Apple laptop driving this presentation. And there's an Apple on my wrist, and there's an Apple in my pocket. So yes, beauty works to an extent, but why do I have all these devices? I have all these devices because they tie me into an ecosystem that works for me. I can use this to connect to this, to connect to that. If I take a picture on my phone, it's available instantly on my computer. That whole walled garden that Steve Jobs came up with is tremendously powerful. But what's failing them at the moment is now the cutting edge, the things that need to move us into the future. So it's always a nice position to be in when you're trying to build a new technology for you to have better technology than everyone else. And user experience is certainly a part of that, but it's not the whole game. Slide. So, commerciality is an important and big piece of this. I used cards for this one specifically because it's a little bit down to chance. Whenever you start a new company, whenever you try to get an idea, you want to sense check it as much as possible. You want to talk to people about it. But there's always the chance that people won't see the genius of your idea. And this was actually one of the first experiences I had when I launched my first company, was that we had a very simple idea for a very simple mechanism which changed a paradigm, kind of unwittingly clever, in fact. And if you showed that to 90%, 99% of the people who would look at such things, they'd say, that's very simple, you can't sell that. And in fact, I had that experience. But because they weren't the end user, they weren't the one benefiting, they didn't see how revolutionary the idea was. And so you do have to have the courage of your convictions. You do have to bet on your idea and really test it. And this is a little bit where agile approaches to building technology fail. Agile technologies lead, I think, quite naturally to incremental innovation. And if you really want to make a difference with your product, if you want to make a difference in the circle that you want to affect, you actually have to believe in your idea and believe that it will make a difference, and you have to find the right people to test it with. So there is chance involved. You'll also see the jokers on this picture. You also have to be excellent at ad hoc rationalisation. You have to be able to look at what you're doing and look back and work out what it is that drew these things together. Digital Science, I said, has 12 companies that we've invested in now. We've actually innovated a couple of other business lines. We have 14 live kind of brands that we work with today. And I work a lot on strategy for the group. So each of the companies we've invested in play into a long-term strategy that we've created around this infrastructure that I told you before. And there's an extent to which I do look for particular companies that fill particular niches that I have in my head based around the strategy that we've defined. But equally, there are the jokers. There are the things that have come along that I didn't see coming along. And you take a bet and you say, actually, I think this fits in. I'm not sure how it fits in yet, but I think it will. And that's where we do things like catalyst grants, our really early stage businesses, where people come to us, and it's where Mark says the kind of €10,000 mark, where I'm actually willing to take a big risk on someone because I'm not taking a big risk financially. It's only €10,000. But on the other hand, I can see potentially where that product is going. I can see that someone has thought ahead of where the market is. It's not something that's obvious, it's something that's actually a little bit quirky, a little bit particular. There's something to it. And so there is an element of chance in this on the investor side. On the entrepreneur side, I'd say there's always an element of risk in what you're doing. And I think Mark made the point excellently. One of the things I learned very quickly when I was starting my first company was that you have to say yes. Saying yes is a painful thing, and becomes more painful as you do more, because yes is the thing that opens you up to the possibility of being successful. At some point, you get used to saying yes, and then it becomes very difficult to say no. And then working out when you make that switch to no is actually really tough. And when you actually get to the point where you need to say no, that's even tougher. But initially, you should say yes to almost everything, because one of those things is the thing that could take you down the right path. And so I think that's where I wanted to leave it, if I'm right. This is the one final thing I was going to say. One of the things that we do try to do at Digital Science is specifically then help with the infrastructure behind the companies. We want people like Mark to be focused on his product. So what we don't want him to be focused on is the financials, the HR issues, the details of how contracts should work. So one of the things, if you find a good investor, what they will do for you is they will help you with the operations side of things. They won't ask you to develop that entirely on your own. And one of the two services that we add on top of that is that we try to do thought leadership in the area, and we try to write reports, and we try to raise the profile of companies that work with us in a number of different ways. And again, a good investor will do that for you. They will find out ways to showcase your company and get it out there. And I guess this is where the smart money thing comes in. It's quite interesting in that if you work with a strategic investor like Digital Science, the payout at the end of the day is likely to be less than with a venture capitalist. A venture capitalist will promise you the earth if the idea becomes successful, but the chance of it being successful is much less. So for those of you who are mathematically inclined, the expectation value is basically constant. You'll have a higher percentage chance of winning with someone like Digital Science, but a lower return. With a VC, you'll have a higher return, but a lower percentage chance of winning. And the thing in the middle, the multiplication of those two things is basically a constant, I think.
There's a couple of things. I think there's a lot to be said for doing a little every day. My brother is one of these people who would love to build a company, and he has a million ideas, and then you have to tell him you have to do some to get to the proof of concept even. But he wants the proof of concept to be ready by like Wednesday. And so he just loses interest and then comes up with his next idea. But if you have an idea and you think realistically, okay, I can have something which is a proof of concept and a slide deck that I can go and talk to people, to send to people like Daniel or working with the Best Never Rest guys, then you can say, okay, here's what I have, here is my proof of concept or idea, and here is how I can sell it to people to get invested in. And if you say, okay, realistically, we're at what, in February now? If you say I do a little every day and I'm going to have something by May, then April, you can start sending out those emails, you give yourself the deadline, and you put it out there. You can also just put things on the web as well and see if you get any bites that way, but that's a lot more speculative. But I think a little every day helps.
Okay, I would say, let's see if I can remember this in the right order, 3 things. First of all, sleep is not your friend. Sleep is something that you need to get used in the first years of your startup to having less of. So I think it does require some commitment to come up with the initial idea, to develop it, and to get to a stage where other people are going to be interested in it. I think also you can't be bored with the idea. It has to be something that you're willing to live. You heard what Mark says. I mean, he's 6 years in, and I know Mark, I mean, we talk about this stuff all the time. Mark does very little but think about Figshare, what different terms it can engage on, how to make it more successful, how the team is doing. I mean, this is for both of us, actually. It's something that we really live. And so your idea has to be something that you think you can fall in love with to that level. And I'd say the third thing is really around being committed to it at a slightly academic level. When I see a deck that's presented to me for investment, obviously if the deck looks beautiful, that's easier. It's just because it's easier to consume the information. But I'm actually looking past how the deck looks most often, unless the product is particularly around UX and it needs that aspect to it. But what I'm looking for is good understanding of the market, good analysis of the competitors, realistic survey of why you are different, what is defensible about your product. And these are the things that actually, if you're going to invest and fall in love with an idea, you should be asking yourself, I'm going to spend the next year of my life trying to pitch this. Is this a good investment of my time? Am I going to be spending my time on something that can really be successful, or am I just being incremental? Is this very similar to someone else's idea, but it's blue instead of pink? You know, that makes a big difference to me as an investor. If you look at the success statistics for a VC, you won't be looking at 80%, you won't be looking at 90%. It'll be the reverse. You'll be looking at 10% if they're lucky. That's the kind of, I mean, if you kind of look at 1 to 10, 1 will be successful, 4 will be somewhat successful, 6 will fail. That's the kind of statistic. Of course, the one that's successful, if you happen to be running that company, you're the kind of Elon Musk, and you know you'll retire if you want to on the cash out. But the chance of doing that is extremely slim. I mean, if you look at the statistics in the UK, I think it's something, I don't know the exact statistics, but it's something like 80% of companies fail within the first year. So the digital science approach is much more measured in a sense, because we will value a company at market value, but because we're in a niche, the research niche, those market values will be less than the market values associated with things like Airbnb, Uber, simply because Airbnb and Uber are leveraging a global user base. You know, billions of people, potentially hundreds of millions of people. And if you do your customer lifetime value calculation and you look at all the metrics and you work out that you have 10 million users and you can monetize each of them at $100 a year, then that's a significant revenue, and you think that you can actually get 50% market share. You know, if those numbers are realistic, your company is going to be worth a lot of money. In digital science world, there are 15 million scientists around the world, or 15 million researchers in public research. Academic institutions do not pay a vast amount for the kind of software that we provide, neither do funders, neither do publishers. But the aggregated effect of all of those different lines together means that the company can become a very solid, very nice company. And the advantage with academia is that people tend not to cancel. If they like your service and you're doing a good job for them, they won't go out to market and look for a competitor to invest in. They will continue to invest in you with your company because they like your relationship and you're delivering value to them. And so in our business, we have very low churn rates. And so At some level, again, there are multiple playoffs. One, large market versus small market. Another, fickle client base versus loyal client base. But at the end of the day, the valuation for a digital science company is on the order of tens of millions, not hundreds of millions. And so that's the playoff you're making by going into a niche space versus the world at large.
So conscious of time and the fact that we've stolen 15 minutes out of your beering session. If there are no other questions, or maybe one more question? Yay!
Try with the voice. Maybe try. That's okay. So that's a question for Zainab actually. Maybe to try and bring some local relevance. I was thinking, what would be the outside factors maybe outside of the control of digital science that make good ideas thrive and reach a different level? And if you were to imagine, if you were to start up digital science here in Yash, what would particularly excite you, or what would concern you?
Tricky. Okay, so the first question first. Obviously, there are no factors that aren't in my control. I mean, to admit to anything else would be a travesty. No, two of the companies, in fact, that we invested in America looked originally like good bets. We put money into them, and then we got nervous because it was quite a lot of money in each case, and they both had a kind of dip after investment for about 6-8 months, and there was a bit of a communications problem. There's a little bit of a cultural difference between how people in the UK communicate and how people in America communicate. So there was a little bit of tension there. And actually then the first company really took off massively. And they took off massively because they'd managed to pivot the business model to find the right client. Sometimes it's not obvious who your client was. When digital science was first founded, the thought was that the client was the researcher. The researcher would pay for stuff that we had. Big mistake. Researchers do not have money to pay for the things that we sell. What we needed to do was find a different client. In Figshare's case, the first client they found was the publisher, and latterly they developed a slightly different model to work with institutions, and that model is now happens to be transferable to funders and transferable to pharma. So there are lots of reuses. Once you do something 2 or 3 times, you actually learn to get to kind of genericize, and as Mark says, make it more cookie cutter. Yeah, that company is now doing tremendously well. They're doing absolutely fantastically. The second company we invested in also went through a very hard time just after the investment, and that was partially due to the cost model that they were operating. It's quite a resource-intensive product, and it was looking quite bleak at one point, and then all of a sudden a client came in, and it was a significant client, and it turned the business around literally in a week. It went from, I'm not sure if we're going to be able to do a second round with the company, or third round, whichever it was, to, okay, now we have people hammering down our door to actually buy into the company because this is clearly going to be big. And so sometimes it really can spin a dime like that. If you get the right client at the right time and someone notices you, this is why I said it's so important to say yes. If you don't say yes, you're not opening up the possibility of the right person noticing you at the right time. I've been really lucky in my career. I can trace the luck I have in my career to about 5 different incidents where I happen to have been at the right place at the right time. You can be as smart as you like. If you don't put yourself in the right place at the right time, you're not going to get anywhere. And so your second question was Yash. So what would be my... I think actually starting up in Yash is really a lot better than starting up in London. London, you have access to many possibilities, but they all come extremely expensively. What you have going for you in Yash is access to a highly talented workforce that you actually can afford to work with. And actually that makes a massive difference. Whenever you're doing a really small startup, when you're not going to an American bank and saying, please can I have 5 million to hire all the people that I want, which is typically where none of us are in the room, not even digital science, having the ability to get really highly qualified people at an affordable rate is a differentiating factor. And Yash has that in spades right now. You have amazingly good people, many of whom we try to hire. And for us as a business, the fact that our only substantive major development hub outside the UK is here. We have a few teams in America, but most of those teams are distributed. We have a lot of teams across Europe working from home, but our development centre, our substantive development centre in the company is in Yash, because we have access to such high quality people, not just in programming, but beyond, as you know, Florian, in design, user experience, testing, all of the different facets, project management we can get here. And so I actually think this is a much more vibrant startup community than a lot of places in London. You have actually the possibility to do a startup here and have a bit of a life as well. I mean, that's a massive plus. The fact that you don't have an hour's commute home, so long as you don't go in peak rush hour, is actually a really big differentiating factor for having a startup here, I think.